this, I could write a better book overnight.
You think you're the smartest man on the planet, don't you?
For the 1000th time, yes!
Education has long been a symbol of status, signifying one's expertise and knowledge. The university standing as the ivory tower atop the shining city on the hill. But is education really a panacea, a universal solvent for all of the ills of society, replacing the darkness of ignorance with the cleansing light of truth? In recent years, faith in academia has been falling, and it's not difficult to see why, with so many major controversies concerning plagiarism and outright fraud, inundating news media coverage going as high as the president of one of the most prestigious institutions of higher education in the United States, Harvard University. Despite more and more people being increasingly distrusting of academia as an institution, advanced degrees still carry with them an aura of authority, and with authority so often comes a tendency to abuse it. Abuse of academic authority, real or otherwise, could not perhaps be more thoroughly highlighted than in one of the most egregious and oblivious displays of intellectual navel-gazing ever made, in a now infamous video from horror YouTuber In Praise of Shadows, or Zane, in which he attempted to smear several other content creators as gun-crazed, transphobic, far-right fascists, largely due to their association with another horror YouTuber, Wendigoon.
Wendigoon is very publicly friends with Turkey Tom. Tom has been accused of using the N-word multiple times in private conversations, including these screenshots of texts that are alleged to be real.
So what he said, am I supposed to get mad?
Wendigoon is publicly connected to the Internet Historian, and has even appeared in his videos. The Internet Historian publicly said that his birthday was April 20th. It is not, and has only said that as a joke because that is Hitler's birthday. Wendigoon is publicly friends with Donut Operator, and even retweeted a photograph of the two of them hugging. Donut Operator is a gun-crazed, very far-right YouTuber with 4 million subscribers, whose career consists of him reviewing footage of police officers shooting and killing people. For example, one of his videos is titled, "Predator Takes Shotgun to the Face," and features a picture of him smiling in the corner of the thumbnail next to an image of a terrified man about to be executed by cops, with the text that reads, "Head removal." And the only thing that one could reasonably gather from this picture of them hugging is that he too is a fascist bootlicker himself.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
He is publicly friends with Shoe on Head, who is a conservative masquerading as a leftist, who says stuff like, Karl Marx rising from the grave finding out his movement has been taken over by fat, ugly, mentally ill losers.
So, the story's about you, isn't it, Will?
He is friends with Brandon Buckingham, a gun YouTuber who has been accused of threatening.
Cucko said himself that people that falsely accuse others of sexual assault should be put in jail. And I agree. That's why I'm suing him for defamation of character.
He is friends with Oompaville, a gun-obsessed content creator that has taken advantage of Nakado Avocado's mental decline for fame and for money.
I'm not gun-obsessed anyways. What the does that even mean? I'm not you're obsessed with Wendigoon. I've never made a 45-minute video on guns talking about ethics and shit. What are you talking about? You're obsessed with all of us!
He is friends with Mutahar, who argued against Andrew Tate being deplatformed from social media websites, and has recently showcased a great deal of transphobia in his most recent video.
Now, looking at this image over here, it is in fact just a disheveled, greasy individual, okay? But the other reality of it is, too, is like, even the person that I was talking about used this person's art, so clearly they didn't care about that artist's attachment to actual sites that they consider to be bad, because if that was the case, if their principles were there, they would never have used that art in the first place.
During the course of what was once an over 3-hour-long video, Zane lamented that commenters critical of his claim that the cannibals in The Hills Have Eyes are really the film's protagonists, and that they represent impoverished Black and Indigenous people, didn't come from a place of sincerity, but rather a place of ignorance, that the unwashed, uneducated masses simply weren't astute enough to understand his media analysis.
The Hill people can be representative of anything that you want them to be, really. They can be Native Americans, and the hills themselves can be allegorical of them being forced back onto reservations. They can be Black Americans that have for hundreds of years been forced to live within a dehumanizing system that has balances in place that assure that they never get ahead. They can be anyone who has been a victim of hundreds of years of horrifically violent, white, wealthy, educated progress. But the tragic and unfortunately thematic logical thing about The Hills Have Eyes is that this plot to rise up against them doesn't work.
He goes on to state that a white man from rural Appalachia, much like himself, just because he happens to like guns, Wendigoon, should not be able to give his opinions on horror because, well, he doesn't have the experience of someone like Zane, and by that, of course, he means being overly educated.
I have no need or desire to hear 5 hours of opinions on Blood Meridian from a 21-year-old millionaire who got famous around the age of 19. There are some works that fundamentally will not be understood by you if you are wealthy and have always been upper class your entire life.
But wait, it doesn't stop there. He went so far as to say that Wendigoon should be barred from polite society, dehumanizing him for not being the scholar that Zane sees himself to be.
So what if he's a conservative? Is that a problem? Which the answer to that is yes. But the reason that I care is because this does not belong in horror, or anywhere. I care deeply about horror, and everything that he does has demonstrated so far in his career that he should not be welcomed in our spaces, or even, just in public in general.
He then spent over half of an hour naming every YouTuber Wendigoon has ever interacted with to smear them via guilt by association with Wendigoon, who he all but directly called a domestic terrorist.
If I accidentally started a hate terrorist organization, I wouldn't rebrand as a horror YouTuber the next year, and instead would try and fight that ideology as much as I could. And if I didn't do that, then it would probably be fair for people to assume that I still agreed with their action.
The self-righteous, condescending attitude through which Zane describes others as right-wing rednecks who cannot enjoy horror because it is exclusively for left-wing intellectuals such as himself.
Horror is an intrinsically left, punk, anti-establishment, countercultural art form that is primarily concerned with social issues and pushing boundaries beyond what is deemed acceptable by traditional, more conservative, polite society.
Smugly pretending to chuckle at the illiterate commenters who disliked his Hills Have Eyes video.
Sadly, you seem to be lost in a pretty bad... Sadly, you seem to be in a pretty bad place right now. Your so-called anatomy is full of hate and cynicism. I hope you'll get better soon.
I'm not owned. I'm not owned. I continue to insist as I slowly shrink and transform into a corn cob.
And then demanding that Wendigoon not only be unable to comment on horror due to his backwards, troglodytic nature, but also be publicly shunned, is known as educationism. That is a tendency to view education and the more educated as superior to the less educated. Today, let's examine educationism, what it is, how it affects the beliefs and behaviors of both the more and less educated in society, and how it ultimately produces a perception in people like Zane that those less academically inclined are fundamentally less human. But before we get into the effects of educationism, we need to start with the state of the academy, and the effects of education itself on shaping the mentality of someone like Zane by looking at the indoctrination of the Ivory Tower. While blindly trusting the science as a concept achieved mimetic status during the COVID years, it is far from new. Sennett and Cobb 1973 described academic bona fides as, quote, badges of ability that serve as a, quote, perfect tool to legitimize power. Since the 1970s, the educationalization of society has only seemingly increased in cultural importance, with credentialism and incessant requests for approved-of academic sources dominating the discourse. One could say that people have become essentially Redditized.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the f*** up.
And need look no further for the centrality of education in public policy than Tony Blair's stated three main priorities for government. Education, education, education. Yes, the paragon of virtue, old tone. I'm fairly certain this guy eats babies Blair. Someone as blood simple as Margaret Thatcher, but nowhere near as competent, surely is a man to listen to on such a subject matter. It's not even just that education is seen as a moral good, but often as a social and political necessity, as Philip Converse wrote in a 1972 article on changes in the American electorate, for example, that education, quote, is everywhere the universal solvent, and the relationship is always in the same direction. The higher the education, the greater the good values of the variable. Of course, it certainly benefits academics to describe academia as a universal good, given the basic structure of higher education. The more you pay, the more you learn, the more you learn, the more you pay, until you finally reduce your thetan levels enough to attain true enlightenment. Oh wait, that's Scientology, not academia. Or is it? If academia is the universal solvent, which it may be given its adherents can't go 5 minutes without metaphorically putting it in a paper bag and huffing it, well, its universality has certainly and demonstrably increased over the last century.
I'm telling you, this is the wrong kind of glue, Charlie.
No, it's not.
This is made for like kindergartners or something.
No, this will work.
Education has been increasingly accessible, which would seem to be at odds with the elite deferential status given to academics as experts and thought leaders. After all, if everyone has an advanced degree, then education cannot be seen as a symbol of superiority. If everyone is special, then no one is. Concerning high school completion rates, Statista data indicate that by 2020, over 90% of US citizens had completed a high school diploma, and concerning higher education, attainment rates of bachelor's and other advanced degrees rose from 7.7% in 1960 to nearly 40% in 2021, dipping slightly during the pandemic. While nearly half of the population over the age of 25 now has a college degree in the United States, attending college for any period of time has also increased across the Anglosphere, as a 2017 through 2018 report from the UK Department of Education indicated that just over 50% of all UK citizens and 57% of women specifically had entered higher education, hitting the goals set by Blair 20 years prior. Despite the increasing ubiquity of attending and completing college, simultaneously, faith in higher education has dropped precipitously in recent years, according to Gallup polling of Americans. In 2015, only 9% reported very little faith in academic institutions, rising to 15% in 2018 and 22% in 2023. Conversely, those with a great degree of faith in the system fell from 28% in 2015 to 23% in 2018, and again fell to 17% in 2023. While this change has affected all segments of the population, the decrease in faith was most extreme in self-described Republicans, those without a college degree, and those over the age of 55. On the subject of education and political affiliation, it's no big surprise to say that, statistically, more educated people are more likely to identify with left-leaning ideological positions. 2015 data from Pew illustrate that while only 5% of Americans with a high school diploma or less reported that they held consistently liberal beliefs, 12% of those who had any college experience were consistently liberal, 24% of those with a completed degree were consistently liberal, and 31% of those with a postgraduate degree were consistently liberal. This ideological leaning has also become more prominent over time, as in 1995, consistently liberal ideological identities were present in 1% of those with a high school diploma or less, 4% of those with some college experience, 5% of those with a college degree, and 7% of postgraduates. That is, the percentage of people with advanced degrees, many of whom will inevitably use those degrees by remaining in the academic system to teach other students who identify their beliefs as consistently liberal, more than quadrupled in under 2 decades in the United States. Amongst self-reported Democrats, this trend was even more pronounced, as 11% of those with a high school diploma or less held consistently liberal beliefs, 24% of those with some college completion did, 46% of those with a completed degree did, and a full 54% of postgraduate Democrats reported holding consistently liberal beliefs. Now, that seems rather low. Of course they hold liberal beliefs, they're Democrats. That's a tautology. But when Pew describes these beliefs as consistently liberal, what they really mean is the most far left on their measured political spectrum. There are potentially real-world effects when beliefs manifest in votes for policy. For example, from the aforementioned Pew report, Americans with a high school diploma were significantly more likely than more educated groups to report that blacks who cannot get ahead in the US are responsible for their own conditions, that immigrants are a burden on society, and that homosexuality should be discouraged compared to those from higher educational backgrounds. Weeklyme 2003, while now dated given the aforementioned changes in social trends, examined the relationship between education and political attitudes that can provide us with some other interesting insights. Using data from the 1989 through 1993 World Values Survey from 40 countries, educational attainment and 4 groups of opinions were assessed: opinions on political issues, morality, confidence in institutions, and general values, including, for example, the belief that children should obey their parents no matter what. Age, gender, and occupation type were all assessed, as well as the GDP of the various countries and previous Soviet bloc membership. They found that education increased support for capitalism, but only significantly in those from countries with lower GDPs, and particularly those that were formerly under communist rule, while there was no effect on economic beliefs about private versus government ownership in the wealthiest nations. Regarding social issues, however, the supposed liberalizing effect of higher education was evident, as it was associated with support for environmentalism and gender equality. More educated individuals tended to focus on individual development rather than money, reject notions of good and evil in favor of circumstantial differences being responsible for human behavior, and believe technology benefits society, while being unrelated to an emphasis on family life, reduced emphasis on work, developing new technologies, and living a simple, natural life. Clearly, Professor Kaczynski was not included in this particular study. More educated people were actually more skeptical about institutions of higher education in poorer nations and those that had previously been under communist rule than the less educated. And while there was a positive relationship between education and trust in academic institutions in richer nations, the effect was minimal. In summation, yes, educational attainment was related to having more left-leaning beliefs on social issues, but also was related to more conservative beliefs on some specific economic issues, particularly in those from poor nations and nations which had previously been communist. This may perhaps be a manifestation of a kind of academic pulling of the ladder up behind you, but I can't say for sure. Of course, correlation does not mean causation, speaking of a phrase that has lost almost all meaning due to its overuse and often incorrect use by sophomore midwits like Zane, but is it the case that higher education causes people to become more left-leaning politically? Or is it that more left-leaning people place more value on education and as such are more likely to attend and then complete higher education degrees? This seems to be a very common argument after all. It's not that university professors are teaching or indoctrinating their students into left-wing political ideologies, it's that people who lean left are just smarter, more enlightened, and thus more educated and concerned with education. But is that contention, despite dripping with the childish hubris of a statement that an actual 3-year-old would make?
Because it's not that she's wrong, she's 3, she's entitled to be wrong, but it's the arrogance.
Actually true. Let's look at the data. A 2008 study from Marini and Hewitt examined changes in political orientation in college students drawing from 3 national-level surveys conducted in the early 2000s. As we might expect, students at religious institutions such as Xavier University, Marani's institution, and my own undergraduate alma mater,
Nobody gives a shit!
were less likely to identify as far left. Students at highly selective universities, unlike Xavier, were more likely to identify as far left. Those in bachelor's programs were more likely to identify as far left compared to master's and PhD students, and, unsurprisingly, students in the social sciences, humanities, and English also tended to be more likely to identify as far left compared to STEM students. There was, seemingly, a shift in students over their tenure in higher education to move further left regardless of wherever they began. As while 1.6% of freshmen considered him or herself to be far left, 3.6% of seniors considered themselves to be far left. Similarly, identification as a liberal was 23.3% in freshmen, but 29% in seniors. Relatedly, fewer seniors identified as conservative or far-right compared to freshmen, dropping from 1.9% far-right in freshmen to just 0.9% in seniors, and 26% conservative in freshmen to 23.6% in seniors. Students at religious institutions were less likely to move to the left than were students at non-religious institutions. Women were more likely to move leftward in college, while those from wealthier families tended to move more towards the right. Faculty also had a significant effect, as students who attended universities with more left-leaning professors became more left-leaning themselves, while the opposite was the case for students who attended universities with more right-leaning professors, although the latter is exceptionally rare. A report from the National Communication Association in 2017, drawing from data from the Economics Journal Watch, found that for every registered Republican professor, there were 11.5 registered Democrats. I thought we stopped counting people as fractions or as an entire cricket team plus a midget, but I digress.
To recap on the rules, it's rounders with extra gay stuff.
Anyway, not all fields are the same as my field, the NCA's field, communication. In Com, for every 1 registered Republican, there were 20 registered Democrats, and in History, for every Republican, there were 33.5 Democrats. As such, while students may be somewhat insulated from a broad left-leaning shift that occurs during their college education by attending religious schools with rare conservative professors, again such as Xavier, for the most part, graduating seniors are more likely to have leftist political beliefs than entering freshmen. A later study from Simon 2022, using data from the British Home Panel Survey collected between 1991 and 2008, examined political opinions towards both economic and cultural issues, specifically environmentalism and gender equality, to examine the relationship between college attendance and those beliefs. For non-graduates, economic attitudes shifted slightly to the left as subjects entered into adulthood, while graduates' economic attitudes moved slightly to the right. And hey, that makes sense, given that more educated people tend to make more money, as we'll see evidence of in a bit, and when you make more money, you may be less willing to give it away. The results were far more pronounced concerning social issues, as while non-graduates became more conservative on environmentalism over time, college graduates adopted significantly more left-wing attitudes. The same trend was the case for gender roles, with non-graduates moving right and graduates moving left. Even longitudinal data, however, still can't really answer the question of what is responsible for these shifts. Are people becoming more left-leaning socially because of education, or are people who are more prone towards left-leaning attitudes more likely to attend and complete higher education? An interesting natural experiment that occurred in South Korea, assessed by Jung and Gil 2019, can provide us with some unique data on the subject matter. Following a military coup, in 1979, South Korea adopted a graduation quota program that mandated a 50% increase in college admissions be achieved by 1983. As such, unlike in countries such as the US and UK, South Korea saw a massive short-term increase in college enrollment, and as such, if college enrollment is associated with changes in political beliefs, then we should similarly see massive changes in political beliefs over a similarly short period of time in South Korea. And yes, that is what they found, as while college education was related to an insignificant 4.3% increase in the probability of being ideologically liberal when using ordinary least squares analysis across the entire dataset, when assessed by birth year as the instrumental variable, attending college was related to an increased probability of having left-leaning political beliefs by 71.3%. So yeah, it seems that college attendance is causally related to being liberal or having left-leaning politics. While I know it likely comes as no surprise to many of you to hear that, as no Redditor would have made it this far into a video about actual science, it is important to illustrate that it's not just correlation, but that there is a causal relationship that exists between attending college and left-leaning political orientation. While that was the case relatively more recently in South Korea regarding higher education, education in and of itself has not always resulted in a left-leaning shift, as we can see in Meyer 2017, who used Eurobarometer data to examine the impact of 11 educational reforms in 18 different Western European countries between 1917 and 1969. Nice. Which increased the minimum level of education between 1 and 4 years, moving the required completion grade of up to the 9th or 10th level, so between the ages of about 14 and 15, again on average. Meyer found that during this time frame, an additional year of education resulted in an average shift towards the right of the political compass by 0.25 on a 10-point scale. When treating education as an exogenous rather than endogenous variable, however, that is, when treating education as compulsory rather than self-motivated, Meyer instead found that additional education resulted in a left-leaning political shift. That is, when education was required by the state, the shift moved left. When it was self-motivated, the shift moved right. Results also varied by country, as while education tended to move students towards the right consistently in Italy, every other country reported mixed effects. Whether education was exogenous or endogenous, any additional involvement in the system moved students away from centrist political positions. Further, it seems that these relationships are not a product of extant political beliefs or familial backgrounds before entering higher ed, as we can see in a study from Surridge 2016 using data from the 1970 British cohort study, which surveyed participants regularly over the course of 30 years. They found via multiple longitudinal level analyses that there was no relationship between educational achievement and social liberalism that could be explained by background or by some psychodynamic effect of education alone. Surridge ultimately did find that those who attended university became more socially liberal as adults, but could not explain why in the data, nor that this effect had occurred as explained by background variables such as parental authoritarianism, nor cognitive ability. This study illustrates that while it's clear there is a relationship between higher education and socially liberal attitudes, if not economic ones, the relationship is not completely linear. That is, attending university will not inherently make one left-leaning politically, nor that one's background is predictive of the liberalizing effects of education. But there is definitively a relationship between the two variables of college attendance and leftism. Moreover, the longitudinal nature of this study illustrates that this effect has been the case for a long time and lasts across generational groups. It is interesting, however, that while there was a small and insignificant but consistent relationship between higher education levels and having economically conservative values, something that was consistent across numerous studies on the subject, that exact same variable, education, is also very consistently and significantly related to socially liberal attitudes. It seems then that while higher education results in more socially liberal people, those same people, having attained a form of success associated with greater economic outcomes, again, we'll see more about that later, became less favorable towards economically left-leaning policies such as redistribution. Well, again, when all background factors were included, the effects of education on economic liberalism were non-significant. It is a persistent trend. Why?
I have a question for God. Why?
Well, my guess, and it is a guess, would be that the more educated and thereby more liberal see their success as deserved and do not want to share their wealth or success with the less fortunate, while still advocating for socially liberal policies that don't really economically affect them too much. I've done a video on dark morality that might help explain that seeming paradox, in that many left-leaning people who espouse support for redistribution of wealth and socialist policies publicly also often want themselves to be the recipients of such redistribution, regardless of their own personal extant wealth.
Money me. Money now. Me a money needing a lot now.
Despite that hypothesis, it is just that, as Surridge herself was also unsure as to what these data really mean. Regardless, we can see a pattern emerging here in that it's not just the case that more left-leaning people are inherently drawn towards higher education, but yes, higher education is related to changes in one's political opinions, producing more left-leaning attitudes, and this has potentially wide-reaching implications on voting and society more generally, which we will cover also in more detail in a later chapter of this video. However, some of the information that we've examined here concern compulsory, primary, and secondary level education, not exclusively collegiate level education, so let's really dig into that. Going to college is a choice. Going to elementary school is not. And although, of course, there are no laws requiring one complete higher education, is there a perception that an advanced degree is necessary that may pressure people into feeling that going to college is required? While it might seem obvious that young people are heavily encouraged to obtain advanced degrees, let's look a little bit more at how prevalent that perception is and how that's changed over time. A 1991 report from Swanson and Tokar, for example, found that in their sample of undergraduate psychology students, a lack of education represented a serious concern in regards to getting a first job or advancing one's career, placing as the third most common barrier for interactional rather than interpersonal or attitudinal issues. And at the time, they probably weren't wrong to place such an emphasis on higher education, believing it to be a key aspect in being able to secure or advance in their careers, as a 2003 College Board report from Bauman Paella found that people with higher degrees consistently earned more money, with the median income for a high school graduate being nearly $20,000 less than the median for a college graduate, resulting in over $1 million more in expected lifetime earnings. And although it wasn't until about age 35 for net earnings to outweigh the costs of the degree, college students ultimately made far more money. While the general trend of advanced degrees being related to higher earnings has not changed, the earnings of those without college degrees has also been increasing over time according to 2024 Pew survey data. Despite the fact that the number of workers without a college degree peaked around 1990 in the US, and despite the fact that, again, yes, having a college degree is still consistently related to higher wages, the earnings, household income, and net worth of both men and women without a college degree has trended upwards since the 2010s, while poverty in those without a degree has declined. or at least was declining until the COVID recession. On that point, the purchasing power of the dollar has changed, and as such, that rise in economic conditions of those without advanced degrees probably isn't indicative of much. However, what is a bit more telling potentially are the opinions of people towards higher education, given that it is again non-compulsory. About half of Americans, 49%, reported to Pew that a college degree was worth less in 2024 than it was in 2004. This was more common amongst Republicans, of whom 57% said that college degrees had declined in importance than in Democrats, of whom 43% said the value had declined. But despite that difference, there is seemingly bipartisan agreement that a degree just isn't worth what it once was. Similarly, 49% of Americans as of 2024 believed a degree was less necessary to get a high-paying job than it was to obtain such a position in 2004, and 34% reported that it was very or extremely likely that someone without a college degree could get a well-paying job. In contrast, of all US adults, 30% said their education was not too important or not at all important in preparing them for a high-paying job. 38% said education was extremely or very important, and 31% said it was somewhat important. The perception that a college degree was not necessary to succeed financially was identical in those with a high school diploma or less, and in those with some college experience, 38%. In Americans with a bachelor's degree or above, 58% said their degree was very or extremely important in preparing them for obtaining a well-paying job. Further, nearly half of all American adults reported that getting a college degree was only worthwhile so long as one was not forced to take out a loan to afford it, something that has become increasingly difficult as the cost of college tuition has soared. According to data from the US News and World Report, in 2004 the average cost of in-state tuition in the US was $4.6 thousand a year, but had risen to nearly $12,000 by 2024. Out-of-state tuition rose from $12.4 thousand in 2004 to $28.2 thousand in 2024, and tuition at private institutions increased from $20.1 thousand a year in 2004 to $46.6 thousand a year in 2024. Even when adjusting for inflation, the trend has been persistent and precipitous. In short, more and more people have been going to college, but at the same time, more and more people are beginning to see college degrees as being less necessary to succeed in life, even if graduates still earn more money on average. It seems then that even if things have changed at a broader population level, educationism as a concept remains persistent. A quick trip to Reddit, perish the thought, or a perusal of basically any political conversation online or off still evidences the pervasiveness of credentialism. Have an opinion on a subject matter? Well, better present your doctoral degree before you state it. Source? Do you have a source? And I know I'm one to talk, but of course, while this pedantry is unserious, it does remain. And thus, despite the changes in the perceptions of the value of higher education over time, we should understand the often invisible but endemic bias of educationism. What is it? How it affects people, relationships, and politics. Someone like Zane, in Praise of Shadows, is educationism made physically manifest in some senses. He seems to see anyone that he perceives of as being less educated than him as not just less able to speak publicly about horror films, but more seriously, that they are less human intrinsically and by his own words, should not be welcomed in society. The dehumanization of the less educated is pervasive. So let's look into the epidemic of educationism. The denigration of the less educated by the more educated is not just something that appears to be a truism, particularly in the post-COVID trust the science world. But what is educationism, and how does it present in how people feel about the importance of education? To start to answer some of those questions, we can look to a study from Cupins et al. 2018, and you are going to hear that name quite a few times, as it's that cohort that has really focused on this subject matter, but who conducted 7 studies regarding attitudes associated with one's educational background. In their first, which was assessed in 3 samples of UK students, Dutch students, and mostly German students living in the Netherlands. Wait a minute, Germans in the Netherlands? I feel like I've seen this somewhere before. Anyway, participants were surveyed on their parents' education level and how warmly or coldly they felt towards a variety of groups on a scale from 0 to 100. including more or less educated people, age groups, and racial or ethnic groups. Oh, wait, no, not again. Relax, I'm making fun of the Germans. Self-denigration is their national pastime. Just like questioning their humanity was the pastime of the entire field of psychology post-World War II. Here's looking at you, Dr. Stanley Milgram. In all three sample groups, though, more educated people were rated more positively than less educated people. There was mixed evidence for the interaction between educational bias and biases towards national, racial, or ethnic groups, with only 2 instances illustrating a stronger national or ethnic bias than an educational bias, indicating that prejudice towards others is less intense based on their level of education than it tends to be based on their immutable characteristics. Parental education was only related to education bias in the Dutch sample, not in the British or German ones. In their second study, participants were asked to indicate their highest level of educational attainment and were asked if they believed people of various groups were independent thinkers or tended to just instead follow group norms, a measure of feelings towards said groups. These groups included different educational backgrounds, as well as 14 others, such as Christian fundamentalists, liberals, military, Trump supporters, entrepreneurs, and disabled people. More educated people were more positive towards others with higher levels of education compared to those with lower levels. However, less educated people were as positive towards those with higher levels of education compared to members of their own educational in-group, and those with a high school diploma or less were less positive towards others in their same educational background than those with more advanced degrees. In short, everyone respects the more well-educated, including themselves. For their third experiment, British participants were provided with a short description of a person that was manipulated by condition regarding said person's educational level and ethnicity, being described either as Muslim or as British. For example, the profile of an educated Muslim read as follows, quote, Mohammed Hussein is 25 years old and currently lives in London, where he works as a doctor. He lives in rented accommodations with a work colleague. People who know him would describe him as a chatty kind of character. He was born and grew up in Bournemouth, but moved to London to go to university. This is where he studied medicine, and he continued to reside after completing his degree. Mohammed likes to play cricket on the weekends.
Cricket is, of course, practiced in Scotland as a homosexual martial arts.
And his favorite hobby is walking his dog, which helps him to relax after a busy day at work. After reading the description, subjects answered several questions assessing how much they liked the described person, how similar they felt to that person, and if they would want to be friends with them. Participants were also queried on their parents' and personal levels of education, as well as their degree of identification with people of a similar educational background. Additionally, the order of the questions varied by condition, such that some were asked the education questions before reading the description of the other person, and some were asked the educational questions after, in order to influence the salience of education as a variable. Respondents indicated a higher degree of favorability towards others of a similar level of education and judged them to be more similar to themselves. While less educated targets were seen as less similar by more educated participants did not report disliking the less educated. Education did not play a role in this trend in liking and feeling similar to those of a similar background. Identification, however, did. Those who did not strongly identify with others of a comparable educational attainment background did not see themselves as more similar to those of their own educational background compared to the less educated. In contrast, for respondents who strongly identified with those of a similar level of education, they identified more strongly with more educated people than they did with less educated ones. This was most pronounced in the most educated participants, as those with high school diplomas or less reported feeling more similar to a target of a lower level of education, regardless of their identification with their own educational group. Those who identified more with their educational group reported liking more educated people regardless of their own educational background. However, this tendency was most pronounced in the more educated. Again, there was a preference across the board for more educated people that persisted regardless of other factors such as ethnicity. Study 4 replicated the experiment of Study 3, but in a sample of US rather than UK adults, and this time used names which are more stereotypically associated with African Americans or with white Americans in the text of the imaginary person that the subjects were given a short description of as a stimulus. For example, Deshaun Jefferson and Tyrone Banks were used as typically African American coded names, while Dylan Johnson and Bradley Smith were used as typically white-coded names.
Africa Nisha Niqua, Kashida, Nataniana Bova Nashria Niqua Niqualis, Courtney.
Subjects were then asked how much they liked this person, how competent the person was, and how hardworking they are. Personal level of education and identification with those of a similar educational background was assessed, and educational salience was again manipulated via question order. More educated targets were seen as more competent, unexpectedly, by all subjects. However, the effect was strongest in the most educated respondents. Interestingly, highly educated participants perceived ethnic outgroups, that is, people who were not of their same ethnic background, as more competent than their ethnic in-group. This effect was not present for those with intermediate levels of education and was reversed in the least educated, who viewed ethnic outgroups as less competent compared to those who shared their ethnicity. Similarly, more educated targets were more well-liked than less educated targets, but highly educated participants tended to like similarly highly educated targets more, while less educated participants expressed similar degrees of liking regardless of education. Clear evidence of educational elitism. Education had no influence on how much subjects reported liking ethnic in-groups versus out-groups. Highly educated subjects who identified strongly with their educational in-group viewed the more educated target as more competent, and while less educated subjects consistently viewed the more educated targets as more competent, identification with their educational in-group resulted in decreased perceptions of the competence of the highly educated. To explicate what all of that means, while the less educated are perhaps always deferential towards the more educated, those of a less educated background who identify strongly with other less educated people tend to be skeptical about the competence of the more educated. As well, they probably should be, given the, I don't know, pick a card, any card, the replication crisis, the plagiarism epidemic that has swept through even the most prestigious institutions in academia, such as Harvard, or the fact that supposed experts such as Anthony Fauci have admitted to just making stuff up. The most educated participants who also identified with their educational class also reported liking other well-educated targets more than less educated ones. Respondents with intermediate levels of education who identified with their educational class liked highly educated targets more than less educated ones. However, the effect was less pronounced than in the highly educated group, and there was no relationship between identification and liking of more or less educated people in those with the lowest degrees of education who also strongly identified with their educational class. That is, the less educated who identified with being less educated don't seem to trust or particularly like the more educated, but they do seem to respect them.
I don't trust you as far as I can throw you, but I enjoy the way you lie.
Thank you, my good man.
For their fifth study, the authors were interested in the importance of meritocracy and hard work in perceptions of academic and professional achievement. Belgian subjects answered questions such as, quote, anyone can get a degree or be successful in their job if they work hard enough, and, quote, getting a degree or being successful professionally strongly depends on coincidence, as well as questions on their personal educational attainment. Generally, subjects tended to view academic success as more reliant on hard work rather than luck, compared to professional success, and while talent was seen as slightly more important for academic success for those with high school diplomas and above, for those without a high school diploma, talent was seen as equally important for both types of outcomes. Academic achievement, then, is broadly seen as the product of hard work rather than luck, and only marginally related to talent comparatively to professional levels of achievement. In Study 6, the researchers examined the underlying factors that may drive these negative stigma towards the less educated in a study of Dutch university students. Participants were surveyed on their social dominance orientation and authoritarian attitudes, and were then asked a series of questions about several groups: the less educated, the poor, the blind, the obese, and, the Turkish.
Thanks for unpausing the video, Hassan. Now, one thing Twitch is certainly known for
Participants were asked about the responsibility that these groups have over their lives and conditions, including questions such as, quote, to what extent are group responsible for the fact that they are group? Seriously, out here asking questions like whether or not it's black people's fault that they're black?
It says, I'm 102% African, with a 2% margin of error. Why, Lord?
Why, Lord, why?
Other questions included, to what extent can group be blamed for their situation? To what extent are group treated unfairly by others? And to what extent does society value group? Feelings of anger, pity, and sympathy towards these groups were measured, and respondents were asked to what degree the government should be involved in helping members of that group. Only the obese were seen as more blameworthy for their fate than were the less educated, while the blind were seen as the least blameworthy group. Insert requisite Daredevil joke here, God certainly did.
Just get out of my sight. I wish you could get in my sight. Because of the blindness. Yeah, no, I got it.
Of all of the groups, the less educated were liked the least by this sample of students, and similarly was the group that they pitied the least, while those pitied the most were the poor and the blind. Seemingly not being able to connect poverty to education, but I digress, as we'll get further into that relationship in just a moment. Respondents were about as angry towards the less educated as they were towards the obese, but anger levels were comparatively low compared to liking and pity ratings on a 10-point scale. Specifically looking further at the comparisons between the less educated and the poor. The less educated were seen as more responsible, less unfairly treated, elicited less sympathy, received more contempt, and were perceived of as less deserving of government assistance. The relationship between anger towards the poor and the less educated was mediated by perceived responsibility. Sympathy was mediated by blameworthiness, and liking was mediated by perceived responsibility and by decreased perceptions of unfair treatment experienced by the less educated. That is, despite the obvious relationship between education and wealth that we've already looked at, albeit somewhat diminishing over time, less educated people are seen as more responsible for their lot and are viewed generally with contempt by university students compared to the poor. It's not really socially acceptable to hate the poor, but it's apparently acceptable to hate those who have less access to education, despite that likely being in many ways a product of poverty. Yep, very cool. But Aiden, I hear you say, this was a sample of the Dutch. Obviously, that's not a representation of normal people, and considering that my best friend and podcast co-host is a South African Dutchoid, I can reasonably predict that kind of reticence from you, dear viewer. As apparently did the authors, because they conducted a similar survey in the US with a few minor changes, replacing the term poor with working class, replacing the Turkish group with black, and dropping the blind from the included groups assessed.
Sorry.
Additionally, desire to help members of these groups was included, as was a measure of individual social mobility, Protestant work ethic, belief in a just world, which simply put is a belief that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, personal education level, identification with their educational group, how difficult attaining education was in their own personal lives, how much effort the individual had expended on their education, and self-reported bias against the less educated were all assessed. As with the Dutch sample, the less educated and the obese were seen as being more to blame for their lot compared to working class people and black people. Relatedly, Americans reported liking the less educated and obese less than the working class or black people, and similarly were angrier at the less educated and the obese than the other two groups. However, strangely and oppositional to the Dutch sample, Americans pitied the less educated and the obese more than the working class or black people. It's worth noting that pity is not inherently a benign thing, as it can come with an aspect of contempt as well. Further, while participants believed all groups were about as deserving of government aid, the group seen as least deserving were the less educated. Perhaps in the minds of these respondents, they wanted to give more money to the less educated, people they seem to otherwise resent, knowing on some level that they also tend to be more impoverished, and maybe also more right-leaning, only to inculcate them into their own ideology. But that's entirely speculative on my part. I don't know if the point in giving them money is to change their politics, but it could be. And these findings really did, frankly, baffle me. And I was even more baffled by the fact that the authors don't really seem to address them in their discussion section, so my best guess is that this is a rare product of significant cultural differences even between two first-world Western nations. I would hypothesize that while the Dutch tend to see the less educated as being responsible for their fate and not deserving of pity because they're perhaps lazy, Americans in turn see the less educated as similarly blameworthy, but also pitiable because they're just kind of, well, stupid, and hence also more deserving of some level of government assistance to edify them into the correct way of thinking, but again, that is just speculative. Similar to the Dutch sample, however, was the trend for Americans to have positive opinions towards working class people despite their seeming contempt and simultaneous pity for the less educated. Of course, this is odd and somewhat contradictory given that working class people are often also less educated, and thus these two groups share much overlap. Looking closer at this relationship specifically, the less educated were reported to suffer more but evoked less sympathy compared to the working class, further emphasizing the seeming hypocrisy of Americans' opinions towards these two groups. It ultimately seems to just depend on how the same group is being described categorically. Are they working class? Well, comrade, that's great. Are they less educated? Well, comrade, off to the gulag with you for re-education. To explicate, compared to the working class, the less educated, many if not most of whom are likely themselves working class, were seen as to blame for their fate, are contemptible and unliked, but also seen as suffering more and are more pitiable and deserving of government aid. Again, my best guess here is that this is just the result of Americans relative to the Dutch seeing the less educated as being too dumb to figure out how to better themselves. But again, I just don't know for certain. Tell me what you think in the comments below. All educational groups blamed the less educated for their fate compared to the working class, but the effect size was larger in those with a high school diploma than those with a 4-year college degree, meaning particularly other Americans with a low educational background felt their circumstances were their own fault. Everyone did, but the least educated were the most denigrating towards their own circumstances. More educated participants, in turn, held more contempt for the less educated relative to the working class. Educational background was unrelated to sympathy and deservingness of government assistance, however. Beliefs in meritocracy were related positively, unsurprisingly, to a belief that the less educated were to blame for their lot in life, and negatively related to perceptions that the less educated had received an unfair treatment in life, suffered or deserved help compared to the working class. Personal beliefs about the difficulty they had faced in attaining their education and the effort involved in that process were also related to the perceived responsibility and blameworthiness attributed to the less educated, indicating that Americans who think they had to struggle to complete whatever their level of education was, and did so by their own merit, were more judgmental of the less educated. Further, despite the rather damning evidence of prejudice towards less educated people across the board here, participants reported very low levels of personal bias against the less educated, with only 24.1% of respondents scoring above the midpoint on a 0 to 6 point scale, but out of everyone, the more educated, the more likely one was to report a bias against the less educated in this sample. In total, across 7 studies, Cubans et al. Illustrated that there is a definitive and persistent bias against the less educated, and that it is persistent in both those who similarly lack higher educational backgrounds and those who have advanced degrees, somewhat dispelling the notion that education produces some type of moral enlightenment. It seems then that despite the definitive left-wing bias present in academia, which one may presume would instill a level of degree of concern or caring for the poor, it actually produces a degree of animus towards the less educated, who very frequently are also poor, without a realization, apparently, of the connection between those two groups.
You stupid.
They're not.
What's 9 plus 10?
21.
You stupid.
But to better understand the true depths of this relationship, we should look to Science et al. 2019, who examined social economic status, or SES, which I know is an acronym that makes it sound like a sex thing, or a crime thing, or a sex crime thing, but which included education as part of its measure, as well as perceptions of the very humanity of those of differing SES categories across 2 studies. In their first study, conducted in a sample of Spanish adults, participants were asked to think either about a low SES or a high SES group, and then answered a series of questions about the humanness of those groups, which included 2 factors: the human uniqueness factor, which includes traits such as civility and rationality, and the human nature factor, which includes traits such as emotionality, cognitive openness, and depth. These factors were further broken down into objective elements related to SES, such as income and parental education level, and subjective measures of SES, wherein subjects were asked to rank where on a ladder of social hierarchy one was placed. They found that participants attributed fewer human nature traits and human uniqueness traits, as well as behaviors, to those of a lower SES status than those of a higher SES status. That is, less educated people were seen as simply less human. To confirm these results and better understand the relationship between dehumanization and SES, in a second study, the researchers provided Spanish university students with brief descriptions of fictional groups of people, describing said group as either lacking human uniqueness or human nature factors. For the group lacking uniqueness, they were described with animalistic language, lacking self-control and being uncivilized, while the group lacking human nature was described as machine-like, being closed-minded, rigid, and unempathetic, even unable to recognize emotions. Participants were then asked to predict that group's SES information, including their place on the social hierarchy, average education level, and income level of the described, as well as to report on their own personal SES background. The group that was described as animalistic was seen as lower on the SES ladder, having lower income and being less educated than those described as machine-like. Participants rated the group described as machine-like as being more similar to themselves on the SES ladder, income, and education level, indicating that university students associated dehumanizing language that emphasized machine-like qualities of an unknown group of people as seemingly being more normal and compared it to themselves, while they associated animalistic traits with poorer, less educated people. In other words, the Spanish university students in this study believed that people who were described using animalistic terminology were more likely to be less educated than they were, while also seeing machine-like traits, despite also being intrinsically inhuman, as more similar to themselves and thereby something positive if not even aspirational. Well, there's an explanation for the whole overly educated Redditor NPC meme now, isn't it? I would say quod erit demonstrandum myself, but I don't use Reddit. So instead, I'll say quod erit Doug Dimmadome.
Not right! Not right? That's right!
To further solidify their evidence, the scholars conducted a third experiment using the implicit association instrument, or IAT, to test the heuristic nature of these associations. Now, anytime I talk about any study that uses the IAT, I have to put in the caveat that it is, academically speaking, stupid. The IAT attempts to get at autonomic, subconscious responses or reactions to stimuli regarding issues that people might otherwise be unwilling to give their honest opinions about, even when anonymized, given the societal implications of said opinions. Most people don't want to admit to being racist. Not all, of course, but most don't.
The Democrats are the real racists.
No, goddammit, we are!
So to test subconscious racism, for example, the IAT flashes an image of people of different races on the screen, and then tests the speed of reactivity towards certain words, positive or negative, in conjunction with those images to attempt to pull out those subconscious biases.
Black people!
The obvious problem with this instrument is that it's just responding more quickly, and that is all that the IAT is assessing, speed of processing. It's not really indicative of prejudice, but rather just heuristics. I won't belabor this point further, just be aware that the IAT is kind of a junk instrument, and I roll my eyes every time I come across a study that uses it, but that being said, let's look at this third study. In this experiment, Spanish university subjects were exposed to a version of the IAT that flashed words related to animals, machines, as well as high and low socioeconomic status, and were asked to quickly respond to whether or not these words were related to a group of people. They found that their sample of college students tended to implicitly associate people of low SES status with animalistic words, while associating high SES people with machine-like words, spending less time in making associations between low SES people and animalistic terms, as well as less time in making associations between high SES people with machine terms. From this series of studies, it does seem then that university students tend to dehumanize the poor and less educated, legitimately seeing them as less human than the wealthier and more educated, such as themselves typically, who they see as more machine-like. In order to elaborate upon these findings and further illustrate the depths to which the less educated tend to be dehumanized, Saenz and Vasquez 2024 examined how educational achievement influenced perceptions of the very humanity of different people and the relationship between denial of humanness and beliefs about democratic participation across another series of 3 studies. To begin their examination into this still rather new area of inquiry, Study 1A sought to just determine the presence of dehumanization based on education in a sample of Spanish participants. Subjects were queried on their personal level of education, and then rated the human and evolutionary status of 7 different groups of people with varying levels of educational attainment. All groups differed from each other significantly, but all participants, regardless of their personal educational background, tended to dehumanize those with no formal education comparatively to others, and those with higher levels of education were more likely to dehumanize those without a formal one. Well, unless this study was conducted at the University of Yarnum, the dehumanization of the less educated here is fairly egregious. In Study 1B, the authors shifted their attention to the role that these humanities scores associated with education were related to the allocation of democratic rights to different educational groups. Participants were again questioned on their personal educational attainment, and then asked questions such as, quote, people with a high school degree should have the right to cast their vote in elections, and, quote, people with a high school degree should have the right to run for public office.
I won a contest, got to be a cabinet member. I'm the Secretary of State, brought to you by Carl's Jr.
All groups ascribed fewer democratic rights to those with lower levels of education, and the most educated were the most likely to believe that those without a formal education should not participate in the voting process nor be able to run for political office. Perceived deservedness of possessing democratic rights increased as education increased, and was most pronounced in those without a formal education, who were the most likely to be seen as not deserving of said rights. In their second study, perceived humanity, voting rights, and rights to be elected were again assessed in a sample of Spanish participants. While there was no difference in beliefs about the democratic rights across the more educated, people lacking a formal education scored the lowest on all three variables: humanity, voting rights, and electoral rights. In general, there was a correlation between democratic rights and education level. Those with low personal levels of education viewed those with high levels of education as functionally more human than the less educated, and thereby also believed that the more educated should have greater democratic rights. Again, the strength of these effects was most pronounced in those with no formal education, for whom the relationship between perceived humanity and possessing greater democratic rights was strongest. In a third and final study, participants read a short vignette about a middle-aged Spanish man named Jaime, who had 15 years of working experience and varying levels of education. Personal educational achievement, identification with one's educational level, and bias towards education were also measured. Once again, there was an educational bias towards those with more advanced degrees, with respondents indicating that the more educated Jaime was, the more humanity he possessed. This was most pronounced in those with lower levels of personal education. And this may come off as particularly ironic for those of you who have participated in any graduate level examination or education programs, as they have a tendency to strip one of either their humanity, humility, or adherence to the mortal coil. But perceived humanity was positively related to voting rights and the right to run for office. These results are indicative that less educated people are seen as less human and, as a result, less deserving of democratic rights. And while this was more pronounced as it applied to the right to run for office, it extended to voting rights as well and was stronger in those with more educational biases, regardless of their own personal level of education. In total, Saenz and Vasquez studies illustrate the existence of an educationist bias, where the more educated one is, the more evolved that person is seen as being, and perhaps more harrowingly, as being more fundamentally human. This dehumanization of the less educated also was related to a belief that they should possess fewer democratic rights, both in the form of voting and in running for office. The bias was present in people of all levels of personal educational achievement, although people who expressed a bias towards education were more prone to ascribe less humanity, and thereby fewer rights, to the less educated, ostensibly calling for scientocracy, all without seemingly ever stopping to ask, well,
are we the baddies?
The effects of dehumanization on the less educated was further examined by Saenz et al. In 2020 across 2 additional studies. In Study 1, Mexican participants were queried on their objective socioeconomic status, assessing to what extent one's economic needs were being met. Subjective socioeconomic status, assessing where participants thought they fell on a ladder between least well off and most well off, including regarding money, occupation, and education. Perceptions of dehumanization associated with human nature, for example, again, emotionality, and human uniqueness, for example, sophistication, as well as their psychological well-being. Both indicators of socioeconomic status were negatively related to measures of meta-dehumanization, while being positively related to well-being. Unsurprisingly then, the more wealthy and more educated tended to be better off psychologically, and believed that others tended to dehumanize them less than the less wealthy and less educated, who were in turn more socially dehumanized. To further understand the relationship between SES and dehumanization and well-being, the scholars conducted a second experiment in a sample of Mexican students. Subjects were asked to imagine that they were going to start a new life in the fictional country of Bimbola, and were assigned to either a low, middle, or high-income group that they would inhabit in that society. Before we get into this, I have to be honest, the findings here are only somewhat pertinent to our overall subject matter, but there's just no way I could avoid including a study involving a fictional country called Bimbola, which sounds either like a disease, or a racial slur, or Julia Civola's stripper name. You pick. Anyway, participants were then asked what items, including a house, car, and vacation destination that they would like to purchase, given the income group that they were assigned to, in order to begin this new life. This procedure allowed the researchers to manipulate both aspects of socioeconomic status. Real-world SES, as well as meta-dehumanization and psychological well-being, were also measured. In total, those assigned to the lower SES position in Bimbola saw themselves as more dehumanized and reported decreased psychological well-being than those in higher SES positions in the fictional country. Further analysis revealed that meta-dehumanization mediated the relationship between SES and psychological well-being, meaning that it's when people of a lower status believe they are being dehumanized in their society that they also experienced decreased psychological health, which in this study included measures of autonomy, environmental mastery, personal growth, positive relationships with others, purpose in life, and self-acceptance. Although education was collapsed into the SES instruments used in the second study, it does provide further evidence for the effects of dehumanization that less educated people believe they experience, and how said dehumanization may be responsible for some of the self-denigration that we've seen in the less educated when they are thinking about education. We have seen that less educated people believe they are perceived of as lesser than more educated people, and thus the real-world implications of this study are fairly clear. Modern society denigrates the less educated, seeing them as fundamentally less human, and when people believe that they are seen as less human, they have decreased psychological well-being. Well then, is it because on average less educated people earn less money that they report lower levels of psychological well-being compared to the more educated? Or is it also because culturally, they know that they are often openly disliked by the more educated, but more insidiously aren't just disliked, they're seen as less human? Clearly, guys like Zane in Praise of Shadows seem to see people less educated than him as less human, and thus worthy of being insulted and slandered. But that's just one example. So what are the real-world effects of an entire group of people feeling as if, due to their educational status, they are seen as being less possessed of human uniqueness? And how does that affect how that group behaves, specifically when it comes to one of the most uniquely human rights, the right to vote and participate in politics? How exactly does educationism affect actual governance? While the real-world implications of the political shift caused by, not just related to, college attendance might seem obvious and something that we briefly touched on earlier in this video, it's also something that we need to evidence with data. And we can do that by looking at a report from Zhang 2018, drawing from data collected by the UK Electoral Commission, the Office for National Statistics, National Records of Scotland, and the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency regarding support for the referendum on the UK leaving the European Union. Zhang found that every additional percentage of university-educated people voting in the referendum would have resulted in an increase in Remain votes by 1.35%. To put that into perspective, while a decrease of about 7% in total voter turnout would have similarly decreased the percentage of votes to leave the EU by 4%, enough to change the outcome of the referendum, if 3% more British voters had advanced degrees, that would have resulted in a 3% increase in Remain votes, which would have in turn shifted the decision from leave to remain. That is then, that one of the most significant voting decisions made in a Western democracy in recent years could have been majorly different had just 3% more Brits attended university. Moreover, the relationship is nearly 1-to-1, again illustrating that college education does not just produce more left-leaning beliefs, but left-leaning voting behavior. In this case, however, total Baz victory.
Day in the life of a true Brexit geezer. Wake up and meet the wife, Susan. My little princess. Isn't she beautiful? Time to take George to football. Rev up the Bugatti, yee!
Given that there is a relationship between college attendance and not just left-leaning political beliefs, but actual voting behavior, and therefore real social outcomes, even a slight decrease in the number of young people who pursue a college education could, and seemingly already has, resulted in major political repercussions, such as Brexit. If a mere 3% increase in the number of UK voters having attended university could have changed that outcome, the long-term political outcomes of half of the adult US population no longer believing that a college degree is a necessity or even advantageous for success is likely also to be significant, to put it mildly. So what exactly are the effects of education on political participation?
I'm retarded?
Meyer 2011 sought to answer that question, largely in a response to a 2008 study that concluded education was unrelated to political participation, and found the opposite to be the case in their, frankly, extremely elaborate analysis. They found that post-secondary education consistently increased political participation, including voter turnout, contacting public officials, and participating in protests or marches. More educated people, both in non-trade and non-vocational areas and in those fields, tended to participate in more politics than did those lacking any formal advanced education. And hey, that makes sense, as not only is there a causal relationship between education and left-leaning politics, but also a correlation between educational status and the belief that one should have the very right to participate in the political system. Sprout et al. 2020 similarly examined the relationship between political participation across two studies conducted in Flanders.
Belgium. We begin in Belgium. Sorry.
In their first, Belgian subjects were surveyed on their education level, identification with those of their same education level, and willingness to participate in a citizens' meeting to discuss social issues and problems. The salience of the perceptions, and in many ways reality, that more educated people tend to be more political, as we've already seen some of and will continue to see more of as we go forward, was manipulated, as before answering the political participation question, half of the sample read that research had indicated that more educated people were more likely to participate in public meetings, while the other half read no such statement. Additionally, political efficacy, that is a feeling that political participation, such as voting, has real-world outcomes, and political competence, that is a belief that one knows more about politics than others, were also measured. Across those who did not identify strongly with their educational class, when education was made salient by reading a statement about the relationship between education and political participation, both those of lower and higher educational backgrounds were more willing to participate in political activities, albeit only slightly. Similarly, more educated subjects who strongly identified with that class were also more willing to participate when education was made salient. However, and in stark contrast, less educated subjects who identified with that class were less willing to participate when their education was made salient. These results seem to indicate that when less educated people identify with other less educated people, likely working class people, and have been prompted to think about their education, they were less politically motivated. Is the reason then that less educated people tend to be less involved in politics really because they just don't care or don't understand? Or is it because there is a perception that something about their level of educational attainment, when reminded of it, activates a self-fulfilling process of opting out of politics due to that perception, not due to interest or lack thereof in politics? The less educated seem to think that they don't deserve the right to participate due to their lack of education. And how could that be surprising when they actively dehumanize themselves while also being dehumanized by the more educated? At some point, it seems, the dehumanization becomes internalized. To investigate this relationship further, a second study again surveyed participants on their education and identification with their educational background. Salience of education was manipulated by the order in which the aforementioned statements regarding research on education and participation was presented in the survey, either before or after asking about intentions to participate in a citizens' meeting, and reasons for why or why not they would want to participate in that political meeting. Reasons were broken down into several types: cynicism, believing that participation was useless; deference to the more knowledgeable on politics; concerns about negative interactions with others; concerns about not being welcomed; and concerns about not being liked by others at the meeting.
An optimist, somebody goes, hey, maybe something nice will happen. Why the f would anything nice ever happen?
Additionally, self-reported interest in politics and external political efficacy, which is a belief that political parties are disinterested or interested in the votes or opinions of the polity, were all measured. And I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but let's get real. Politicians just don't care about your opinions or your feelings or your life. Just your money and your vote.
Democracy is cringe. Read some Aristotle.
So a little bit of low external political efficacy is really just being rational. Participants with a high school diploma or less were less likely to be willing to participate than those with a college degree, maybe because they had something called a job, but I don't know. When looking at reasons to participate as indirect variables on this tendency though, deference to the more educated and a belief that similar people did not typically participate in such activities were the most strongly negatively related variables to willingness to engage, followed by a feeling that others would not be happy with their participation, perhaps fearing ostracization or conflict due to being dissimilar to others at the proposed meeting for not being more highly educated and surrounded by a bunch of, well, nerds! More educated subjects were generally more willing to participate, but less educated subjects were particularly less willing to engage in political discussion when primed with information indicating that less educated people were less politically active and least willing when their personal education was also made salient by being questioned about their educational background before being queried about participation in the meeting. Consistently, not only then are more educated people actually more politically active in practice, it appears that because the less educated are less politically active, they are disincentivized to become so in the future, particularly when thinking about their education level. If you want to discourage political participation in a portion of the population, namely conservatives, who tend to be less likely to have advanced degrees and more likely to have a negative opinion about higher education, well then, focusing your messaging around voting and politics around educationism is certainly a potentially useful strategy. There may be an element of learned helplessness here, in that if less educated people are led to believe that other less educated people are also less politically participatory, and they are, then that seems to produce a lack of willingness to become participatory oneself, either because of one's group not being represented and creating cynicism towards the entire system, or because of a feeling that one is not worthy of participation, instead giving deference to the more highly educated. The result would be the same. By focusing messaging on credentialism and educationism, less educated, statistically more often conservative people will be less likely to engage in politics, creating a cycle. While yes, the more educated always tend to be more political, academic elitism within the cultural milieu seems to have a very real and measurable influence on not just actual outcomes in politics, but even a willingness to communicate about politics. Although, of course, there are some outliers.
And that's the way it will be. God's will be done. Through me.
So, if education influences who actually participates in politics, and we know that changes in participation based on education can and have had real-world implications, what other effects does education have on political beliefs and attitudes that may incentivize the emphasis on education as important in influencing politics? What political beliefs are held by the less educated compared to the more educated that affect policy via their lower level of political participation? A study from Easterbrook, Coupens, and Manstead 2016 utilized data from the British Social Attitudes Survey, which collected data in various waves between 1986 and 2011.
All the local communities are out there on the streets, beating the shit out of each other. Yeah.
As well as the International Social Survey Program, which included data from 15 surveys conducted in 48 countries between 1995 and 2011 to assess the relationship between educational qualifications and several socio-political variables. In the BSAS sample, degrees of education were associated with a 26% increase in interest in politics, and in the ISSP sample, degrees of education were associated with a 22% increase in political interest. Political interest, well-being, and nationalism all decreased over time in the British sample, but not in the international one, in which political interest remained stable over time. In both samples, political cynicism was lower in those with a college degree compared to those without educational qualifications. Regarding attitudes towards immigrants, which tends to be a common political dividing line, having a degree was associated with a decrease in negative attitudes, amounting to 19% compared to not having a degree, while having no degree was associated with an increase in negative attitudes by 13% in the international sample. Consistently then, having a degree was related to being more positive towards immigrants themselves. For immigration in general, having a degree was related to a decreased preference in the UK by 16% and by 13% internationally. Understandably, as if you have a degree, you will be less likely to be competing with low-skill migrants for a job. There was little influence of holding an advanced degree on nationalism in the British sample, and while the effect of higher education on nationalism was weak internationally, having a more advanced degree was related to decreased nationalistic attitudes. In total, level of education explained 7.5% of variance in political interest in the UK and 4% internationally, 10% of variance in the UK and 5% internationally in terms of negative attitudes towards immigrants, and 3.5% of the variance in nationalism, but again only in the international sample and not in the UK sample. These results further illustrate then the effects of education long-term, not just on holding more left-leaning political beliefs, but also on general interest in politics, meaning that those with more advanced degrees are not just more likely to lean left politically, but also be more political and more politically involved than those without such degrees. As we've seen, the importance of identification with one's educational background on a variety of factors, we should also then see the effect of education as being a defining feature of someone's sense of self on political outcomes specifically, which was assessed in a series of 3 studies from Coupin's 2015. Their first study drew from the Understanding Society and Citizenship surveys of interviews conducted in the UK between 2010 and 2011, which included information about participants' educational qualifications, identification with their level of education as being a part of their sense of the self, personal well-being, attitudes towards immigration, and trust in various social institutions, including the police, parliament, and their local council. They found that Brits with university degrees were significantly more trusting in social institutions, reported being more satisfied with life, were healthier, and were more favorable towards immigration compared to those without university degrees. Further, identification was related to all 4 outcome variables, indicating that the more participants believed their education was important to their sense of self and their personal identity, the more trust they had in institutions, healthier they reported being, and the more supportive they were of immigration. It shouldn't come as a shock, however, that people who are part of the institutions at least reported that they had more trust in those institutions, because to say otherwise would be, well, something of a self-report.
I'm gonna report the other guy. Oh, I reported myself. Wait, what the f? Why can I even do that?
Study 2 sought to evidence a relationship between educational attainment, identification with education as important to one's identity, which included several subscales to measure solidarity with one's educational group, satisfaction, the centrality of that identity, self-stereotyping, and homogeneity, which is a feeling of being similar to others in the group, and found that satisfaction was the most important dimension in predicting the relationship between education and identification with one's educational group, followed by centrality, then self-stereotyping, and then solidarity, with homogeneity being non-significant. That is, once again, we see further evidence that less educated people are less satisfied with their educational qualifications, and thereby are less likely to identify with their educational group. Although we've already seen plenty of evidence for this tendency, this study does elucidate that it is predominantly satisfaction that moderates that association. With these findings in mind, in their third study, the authors were interested in understanding the effects of identification with education on several outcome variables, including life satisfaction, political attitudes including interest in politics, and political cynicism, attitudes towards immigration, and symbolic racism, which sounds like this.
Tell me this before you go. I am loud and obnoxious. I like music and rhymes. I'm a fraction of the population, but commit half the crimes. Who am I?
But actually was measured with questions such as, quote, Irish, Italians, Jews, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors, end quote. I don't really think that that's a measure of any sort of racism, symbolic or otherwise, but that's what we have to work with here. The salience of education as being of relevance was manipulated by asking questions about the importance of education before or after assessing the outcome variables, as well as identification with and self-esteem related to one's educational group. they found that higher education was related to greater life satisfaction, less negative attitudes towards immigrants, and decreased symbolic racism, while being unrelated to political cynicism. Once again, those with a college degree were more likely to identify with their educational group as important to their identity, with satisfaction being the more important factor for those with degrees, followed closely by public self-esteem as being part of the educated class. Although perhaps that's just all sunk cost fallacy, I don't really know. When subjects were thinking about education before answering the questions about the outcome variables, those with less educational group-associated self-esteem reported being as satisfied with life regardless of whether or not they had a 4-year degree. It was actually the less educated who were the most satisfied with life, but only when they were high in in-group self-esteem for those of their same educational group. The opposite was the case for life satisfaction and non-esteem-based identification with one's group. That is, while those without a 4-year degree tended to be high in self-esteem, when their non-esteem-based identification with their educational group was stronger, those with a 4-year degree began to surpass the less educated in life satisfaction only when education was salient. People with less formal education actually seemed to be more satisfied with life, but that relationship was reliant upon identification with the educational group to whom they belong, and self-esteem thereby related to that identification. That is, it seems that less educated people are happier as long as you don't bring up their education level specifically. Looking more at politics, those with lower non-esteem identification were less interested in the political, but those with a degree were less interested than those without a degree. But this reversed as identification increased, with degree holders being far more interested in politics as their identification with education went up, while interest in politics decreased for those without a degree who identified more with their in-group. People with degrees or without degrees tended to be less interested in politics when they didn't identify strongly with their educational group, and for those with degrees who viewed that degree as a key part of their sense of self, politics was particularly important, perhaps in part because they see themselves as more deserving of political rights, and even outright more human rights, as we've seen. Regarding anti-immigrant attitudes, the results were even more pronounced. Degree holders who did not identify with their group and had been primed to think about education held equally negative attitudes towards immigrants as did those without a degree, and who had been similarly primed to think about education. As identification with the group increased, anti-immigrant attitudes plummeted, but only in the group with degrees who were thinking about their education. In contrast, those with a degree who did not identify strongly with their group held very little animus towards immigrants when not thinking about education, but held more negative attitudes when they did identify with their educational group and had not been primed to think about the subject of education. Identification had no influence on attitudes towards immigrants and those without degrees, although when education was salient, their attitudes were slightly more negative. What might explain this finding? Well, I'm someone with somewhat bizarre but relatively conservative political opinions towards immigration. I mean, not compared to some people, but relatively. But I'm also someone who identifies with the ideals, if not the realities, of academia, and thus, according to these data, someone like myself may report more negative attitudes towards immigration when not thinking about what is anticipated of those from a more educated background, and how those beliefs do not align with what is seemingly expected of those of us with advanced degrees. We are seemingly supposed to be politically aligned as a group, and only when thinking about that group stereotype are we more likely to report opinions that are similar to said stereotype. It makes sense then why those who don't identify strongly with their higher educational background and who are not primed to think about that identity diverge strongly towards the academic, not just stereotype, but statistical reality, that more educated people tend to have more liberal and left-leaning beliefs, as we can see made manifest here in these data. Similarly, symbolic racism, which I've already raised an issue with regarding the measurement of, much as with negative attitudes towards immigrants, was higher in the more educated when their education was not salient and when they did not strongly identify with their educational group, although these relationships were not as pronounced as the effect of education, salience, and identification on negative attitudes towards immigrants. When education was more salient, reported symbolic racism was lower in the more educated respondents. In other words, the more educated were more symbolically racist, for as little as that term means, when not reminded of their educational status.
He knows more homeless people than any of us. Go check out the hood, dog.
In total, then, it's not just mere education that seems to be related to more or less conservative opinions towards a political issue, in this case immigration, but also related to egalitarian beliefs, spuriously labeled here, in my opinion, as symbolic racism. Just to reiterate, this instrument includes items such as, quote, if blacks would only try harder, they would be just as well off as whites, end quote. Blacks are demanding too much of the rest of society, end quote. Discrimination against blacks is no longer a problem in the United States, end quote. Over the past few years, blacks have gotten more economically than they deserve, end quote. Now, whatever your personal opinions are on those questions, to me they seem to be measuring fairly average conservative or even libertarian colorblind perspectives or Protestant work ethic, not racism. Which is why it's important to always actually look into what social scientists call their instruments, as they can often tend to be poorly titled at best and blatantly misleading at worst. Or to borrow a phrase from the late great Norm Macdonald,
commie gobbledygook.
It is perhaps because of things like academic instruments being poorly, maybe even intentionally poorly titled, and then used as evidence that less formally educated people are racist, that there is so much discontent in social institutions and politics, as seen in not just the beliefs held by the less educated, but in their voting behavior. And we can see how that manifests in a qualitative study from Noordzij, De Koester, and Van der Wal 2021 in a sample of Dutch citizens who had not completed education beyond a secondary level. Well, roll the requisite clip.
There are only two things I can't stand in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures, and the Dutch.
Participants were first asked to write down their opinions on politicians in general, the answers to which were then used in subsequent interviews, wherein they were first asked about why they liked or disliked said politicians, and then asked to supply the researchers with a picture or video of a Dutch politician, and then asked to explain what they liked or disliked about that person. Interviewees frequently spoke of a perceived cultural disconnect between regular people, such as themselves, and politicians, who they described as living in a different world, with one participant, Esther, describing it as a skybox.
Whoa! Oh, and we have liftoff. Thank you for choosing to fly with Khajiit Space Mission Airlines.
Subjects frequently use us versus them language in terms and phrases such as easygoing, normal, and common to describe themselves and those similar to themselves, illustrating that the less educated tend to see their social group as being pretty disconnected from politicians. As a result of this perceived disconnect, it should come as no surprise that these participants also viewed politicians as being, at best, clueless, with Monique saying, for example, they don't know what it's like to be at the bottom, or as being deliberately insensitive towards their interests, with Robert saying that the politicians just, quote, don't give a damn about the people, and these beliefs were backed up by personal anecdotes given during the interviews. Educational disparity was specifically raised by some interviewees, such as Elizabeth, who expressed that politicians she disliked tend to be, quote, fairly well educated and say so, but they are so far removed from the average Dutch person, who they don't talk to, end quote. Relatedly, other participants, such as Jan, indicated that they believed the removal from the average person, as described by Elizabeth, was intentional on politicians' part, stating that they, quote, simply just refrain from behaving like the common people, and, quote, wouldn't be seen very drunk at a bar, but many common people are. I would say, sure, Jan, but I guess Dutch politicians just aren't built like UK ones.
What comes next, though? 2015, can you hold on to it?
I'll go for a pint.
Perceptions of educational elitism in the political class was a frequent theme, with Dennis saying that, quote, after having followed a couple of studies, politicians, quote, suddenly go into politics and tell everybody how they should do things, while Anna described the minister as a, quote, paper bitch who doesn't get it. What's with Anna's and having no chill?
And I have a specific example of someone that worked here that has said something very similar to her.
Oh, interesting. Okay, it can't be your nephew because he has no self-awareness. But anyway.
Not all politicians were seen as equally out of touch, however, as several respondents spoke positively about local politicians that they viewed as approachable, down-to-earth, and representative of the common people. Perhaps because if they try anything, the citizenry knows where they live. Another area of perceived cultural difference between politicians and less educated citizens was in their style of communication, which Thomas described as them saying, quote, a lot, but actually saying nothing, and Jan just directly described as academic. Politicians were also often seen as being disingenuous, deceptive, or as intentionally not being straightforward to the people. To exemplify these perceptions, let's listen to an excerpt of a conversation held between several interviewees. Recreated, of course, for the purpose of this video.
Whenever you ask a question to which they could just answer with a yes or no, then you get an endless reply, meaning that you lose track of the story. And if you dissect it, you still don't know the answer.
Then they still haven't said anything.
No.
They can withdraw everything, because then they have used a point, an invisible one, and I'm just completely fed up with it. Just say what you think. Speak normal Dutch. It's got nothing to do with the normal Dutch language.
And what does that show you? That they talk like that?
That they want to wriggle out of everything, through whatever turn.
It's also, they don't want to say yes or no really, really loud, because otherwise you can make them accountable for it.
Once again, though, this was not universal for all politicians, as respondents reported having respect for those who they believed were being honest, clear, and as Thomas put it, quote, just normal.
Just be normal!
Finally, several interviewees spoke about politicians as being arrogant and outright dehumanizing towards the common people, which, as we've discussed, is seemingly the case, and was illustrated in talk between subjects when discussing the Prime Minister, Mark Rutte.
That's how he comes over to me, as if he really feels superior. He looks at you like you're a worm.
While there was no comparative group of more educated Dutch participants against which to contrast these conversations and perspectives, across the many studies that we've looked at here today, it doesn't seem as if they're off base. Educationism does tend to produce feelings of superiority and inferiority that extend into political action, in large part because people like those interviewed in this study who believe that they are seen as less than by the credentialed academic class, and it's hard to say, from the data, that said perceptions are unwarranted. So with all of the evidence for the very real and dehumanizing nature of educationism, I think it's time that we come to a few conclusions. Someone like In Praise of Shadows, Zane, in truth, is the monster that he believes he is fighting, a beast of his own creation. One need only take a look in the mirror to witness the horror within. Credentialism and educationism are a result of high-trust societies formerly present in Western Europe. At its best, the Academy represents an unbroken line from Aristotle to Aquinas to Newton to Tesla, and all the scientific wonders of the modern world. The immense achievement of Western nations in creating, maintaining, and nurturing an engine of discovery and constant reappraisal is one of intellectual steel sharpening. We hold these high ideals about human knowledge because we are taught to believe in those who supply us with it, to revere those who have dedicated their lives to the expansion of human knowledge. In Praise of Shadows and many other supposed intellectuals wear this vast legacy of great men of science like a skin suit. They exploit the residual legacy of peaceful, trusting nations built by greater men to accomplish lowly and temporary political goals, or in his case, social goals, and in the process setting fire to the very trust in the trade that they rely upon. In Praise of Shadows, of course, benefits from educationism. It allows him a cloak under which to operate, and it shields his arguments, intentionally misleading or not, from criticism from the very people that it aims to demonize. The modern state wields the education system like a political sword. It inverts this reverence for knowledge into a disdain for those not included into its rigid methods of thinking. A friend-enemy distinction dividing the educated, or credentialed, and the uneducated into political factions, carrying also an implied moral failing on the part of the uneducated. Gone is the 18th or 19th century appreciation of the autodidact, the self-taught maverick, the gentleman scientist, or the eccentric obsessive. In its place, we find only grubby contemporary politics. If we are to fight the creeping entropy seemingly affecting all areas of life, we must be honest with ourselves about reality. We must fix our eyes on more lofty ideals and goals than blindly serving party politics and party projects. Human civilization rests ultimately on belief. We believed those higher than us in the hierarchy would do their best to keep civilization alive. We believe those with credentials who have dedicated their lives to education do so in the service of a higher goal. We trust because we would like to think that, if put in their position, we would feel the weight that being responsible for human knowledge places upon us and act accordingly. That we could be our higher selves in serving higher goals. If anything, the gulf between the rosy picture of those who revere Western education from afar and the political nest feathering of those at its heart shows the immense moral failing on the part of the most educated in society. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think that Zane had good intentions in his video denigrating Wendigoon and his friends, or is he just a jealous, spiteful, overly educated twat? Have you ever experienced dehumanization or discrimination as a result of educationism in your own life? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, because I am genuinely interested, but also because it does help this video in the algorithm so that more people can see it. While you're down there, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. If you want to hear more from me, I do a weekly news podcast every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. GMT with my co-host Spoon on the Broken Crown channel, which will be linked in the description, where we also play a Pathfinder 2nd Edition game on Tuesdays at 7:30 p.m. GMT. You can also catch me on Thursdays on Geeks and Gamers Tabletop, where I play a D&D 5th Edition game. If you would really like to support my channel, you can do so on Patreon or Subscribestar to see your name listed with these fine folks. By supporting me, you'll gain access to my Discord server where we watch previews of the videos before they go live and just kind of have a good time. If you would like something more tangible for your support, you can also check out my merch store, all of which is linked below. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.